Hello there, Cardinals. It's me, Mr. Ernst, and in this video, we are going to be talking about trend lines and something called a correlation coefficient, okay? But first thing I want to talk about is the trend lines. Now, we did talk about this briefly in the previous video where we were talking about pizza. A trend line is simply a linear line, or in other words, a straight line that follows the data of the graph. Okay, it kind of tries to shoot through the middle of it. So right now I have my line tool, and I'm going to be creating a trend line for each of these different graphs. I have 7 different graphs set up here, okay? And all I'm going to be doing is making a trend line. So for this first one, again, I want to try and this one's nice and easy. The dots are in a nice straight line. Boom. There is my trend line. For my next one, again, these guys are a little bit jumbled up, but not too hard to strike a line through them. I want something nice and in the middle of them. Boom. There's the trend line for that one. Again, what it's supposed to do is show the trend of the data. For this one up here, the dots are starting to become a little bit more spread apart, and it's starting to become a little bit more difficult to do this. But again, I can kind of see these are still moving in a downward direction, similar to these two. It's just a little bit more spread out. So for example, that would be a good trend line for that one. It is trending downwards, okay? Example, if I was to draw this upwards, this is not a good representation of what the data is doing. The data isn't going up, and you'll notice that there's almost no dots down here, almost no data points up here, so this is not a good trend line. So once again, a good trend line tries to go through the data to show what is the trend, what is the data doing, okay? Now, this center one is a scatter plot that does not actually have a trend. I could try to draw a line through it, but, I mean, there's still a bunch of them over here, still a bunch of them down here, so that's not a good representation. I could try it this way, but again, I'm missing all these ones and all these ones. This one actually doesn't have a trend, so it doesn't get a trend line. It's not going up, it's not going down, we can't see what it's doing, so it's just anonymous. We don't really know what it's doing. Maybe not anonymous, but an anomaly. There we go. It's all over the place. Over here, this one is still kind of separated out, but it's starting to move in a positive direction. So trend line moving in a positive direction this time. Again, it's starting to get closer. It's going to be easier to draw that trend line. The data is trending upwards again. And then once again, the easiest where they're all nice and lined up. Whoop, just like that. Cool. So notice that of all of my trend lines, these ones, negative, negative, negative. These are all negative slopes because they're pointing downwards. The slopes are, each one of these slopes are pointed downwards. Ooh. And then over here, all of my slopes are pointed upwards, which means all of these are going to be positive slopes. So if I was to write out the y is equal to mx plus b, the slope of all of these would be positive. Slope of all of these would be negative, okay? So thinking about it, if all of these ones would be considered negative, all of these ones would be considered positive, what do you think this one in the center is going to be? Zero. In fact, I'm going to change the color because now we're talking about the second part of this, which is a correlation coefficient. And this one we're going to start off with is a 0. It has a correlation coefficient of 0. Okay? And then to give you an idea, this one over here on the left-hand side is completely straight but going negative. So if they're all nice and straight, I'm going to label this one as a -1, and I'll talk about this more in a moment. And this one's perfectly straight but going positive, so this is going to be a +1. Okay, so these are, again, all of my correlation coefficients so far. Now, to explain what this is, a correlation is basically how straight the data is, or how close the data is. If you have, for example, something like this. This data is really, 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 really strong. It's all really tight. It's all really together. It looks really good. This is a very positive correlation. This is a good correlation of 1. This one, the data is starting to separate out. Still a pretty good correlation, but not quite there. This maybe has a correlation of 0.7. So it's not quite a 1 because it's separating out. You notice the data points are a little bit farther away from the trend line. Down here, the points are really starting to separate out. This one's probably going to be a 0.3. So it's going to have a correlation coefficient of 0.3. So it's still positive. It is still moving in an upwards direction, but the data points aren't as close as they are with this one. This is the strongest correlation. This is a weaker correlation. This is no correlation at all. There is absolutely no correlation at all here. There's no pattern for the data. Nothing's happening here, okay? Down here on this side, again, we have -1 because this is perfectly straight, but it is negative, so it is going to be a -1. This one, very similar to this one over here. This one is still moving downwards. The points are fairly close to one another, so this one's going to be a -0.7. And then this one, for example, right here, again, the points are a little bit farther away from the data line. Looks a lot like this one, but again, it's going downward, so this is going to be a -0.3. Again, these numbers just represent how close the data points are. None of these data points show any kind of pattern, so no correlation, there's no pattern. A little bit of a pattern and a little bit positive, so positive 0.3. Pretty close pattern, 0.7. And then you have a perfect pattern of 1. Okay? So that is your trend line. The red line's going through them to show which direction they're going. And then you have the correlation coefficient, which tells you how strong the data is. Okay? Let me give you a real-world example of this real quick. No correlation. This would be if you had, for example, actually, you know what? We'll talk about that in a different video, I think. I don't want to get too far into this. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.